Joanna Nelson Rendon, who is the Director of Young Adult Services for the Pikes Peak Library District, as well as Becca Phillipson, who is the Young Adult Services Senior Librarian for the Pikes Peak Library District. So I am now going to turn it over to our presenter.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Becca. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay. Hi. So I'm Becca Phillipson.
And I'm Joanna Nelson Rendon.
So we just wanted to do a quick overview before we got started, kind of about what we're going to talk about. So the first thing we're going to do is overview of what exactly social emotional learning is. We're also going to do a practical application of some of the principles, so how you can actually apply it in a program. We're also going to talk a little bit about how to address your administration who might be more reluctant for you to implement some of these principles into your program.
All right, so this is Joanna, and I'm going to go over just the 5 components of what is social and emotional learning. So this is from Ready to Lead, which is a report by the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning. So to dig into these 5 different areas, which I would just preface by saying, I think we all, not just high schoolers, but we all can really learn about and keep improving on. So self-awareness is knowing what we're feeling in the moment and having a realistic assessment of our own abilities and a well-grounded sense of self-confidence. So we know who we are. We're aware of what we're good at, what we might need some help at. And then social awareness kind of takes those same ideas and pushes it outward. So we're able to understand what others are feeling. We're able to take on their perspective. And we can appreciate and interact positively with diverse groups. Then self-management. This is where we can really handle our emotions so that they facilitate rather than interfere with the task at hand. It's also about being conscientious and having the ability to delay gratification. And, cupcakes make that hard. And then we also persevere in the face of setbacks and frustrations. The next one here is relationship skills. And this is how do we handle emotions in relationships? Because as you know, they can get really heated. And that we're able to establish and maintain healthy and rewarding relationships. That really makes a big difference in people's lives. And then the last one here, responsible decision making. This is where we make decisions based on accurate consideration of all the relevant factors and also take into account consequences of those actions. And then it's also about taking responsibility for one's decisions. So to kind of start illustrating that, we wanted to dive right into a program that we've done for a while and that we set up without the intention of building social and emotional learning in our teens. And that's our First Friday gaming program, which is something that is a place where teens come and they hang out, they get to know each other, and they compete. So a few of the things that they really are learning in our First Friday gaming is with relationship skills. So they negotiated the rules that we play by. And this is really helpful for people like me who only play video games on their phone, and it consists of solitaire. So I'm not the most knowledgeable person about Super Smash Bros. But so one of the big things that we figured out is that we needed a rule that said you could not pause the game while they're playing. And I'm just curious if anybody in the audience knows why you should not pause the game while you're playing. So type it up in the chat here. If you don't know, that's okay. I didn't either. See one person typing. So if you're not sure, that's okay. One of the things that can happen is when you pause the game, basically when it's unpaused, the people's reaction time or the control that they're giving, it might not be received quickly enough, and then the character could die. So that's a thing to figure out ahead of time. And the teams really negotiated that with each other. Another thing that we really saw be developed and learned in the First Friday Gaming program was about self-management. Because teams really have to learn to be okay with not winning. And a few years ago, we had a teen who really hated to lose, and his behavior was really inappropriate. For example, he would yell, he threw his very own controller on the ground, which is concrete. And in order to keep him going, he really needed to learn to be okay with not winning and with helping other people really feel okay with winning. So he learned how to manage his emotions so he could continue to play, but he didn't have to do it all on his own. So he had help from everybody else, and that really was the social awareness piece where people are able to take other people's perspective into account, and teens in this group helped other teens help that teen learn how to be a better loser. And it really made a big difference, and I could see growth in the teens who were helping and the teen who was a sore loser. So that's just one example of what we're doing, and that you're already doing this, even without being intentional about it. But now, when we talk about this, you can say, oh, I can nudge in this direction. So then, the next thing is, why is it important? And what I would like for you to do in the chat is just throw out a few ideas about why you think social and emotional learning is important. And then Becca's going to get into some of that as well.
Good. People are typing. Okay. Multiple attendees are typing. Even more excited.
Yay.
Yay. Okay. So Nancy says these are skills that are necessary to succeed academically, socially, and in the workforce. Awesome answer. Colorado State Library, being self-aware is a critical skill for everyone. So true. Teens need to learn how to self-regulate, and learning from others their age can be helpful rather than having to hear it from an adult. All super great answers. I realized how I have a 3-year-old, and as I was working with him and focusing on like naming emotions and all that stuff, I realized how powerful it was for me too. And so I think that's just a really great example of how all ages really can benefit from this kind of learning. So to dive in, thank you guys so much for participating. We're going to delve a little bit into prevention science. So this is really used in the public health community, but I think there's a lot of overlap between our goals, which are happy and healthy teens. And so we can learn a lot from what they've already studied and researched. So they've really spent a lot of time looking at different elements in a young person's environment and how those different elements affect them either positively or negatively. So there are certain things called risk factors that the more of these that a young person is exposed to, the more it increases their likelihood of engaging in health compromising behaviors, whether that's delinquency, substance use, those types of things. On the flip side, there are also protective factors. So these are things that if they are in a youth's life, they help buffer young people either from feeling the impact of the risk factors as much, or help help them change how they respond to the risk factor. So you can kind of see what we have on the screen is a chart of those two different factors. And this comes from Communities That Care. It is a program that communities can implement in their community. Here in Colorado, there are about 50 of them, 50 communities implementing this right now. It's like a 5-year grant cycle, I think, coming from the state public health department. So that's where I first learned about risk factors and protective factors. So if this is really interesting to you, I would encourage you. There's a lot of resources you can go on. Thank you. There's a link in the chat that you can click on to look at if you want to look more into it. But the reason we're talking about this is because social and emotional learning is a protective factor. So when I look at these two things, I look through the risk factors, and there are so many things there that I can't necessarily affect, especially through the library in a program. I'm not going to be able to change, what their family life is like. I'm not going to be able to change necessarily if they are a family that is at an economic disadvantage. I'm not going to be able to change those things. But if I can give them tools and kind of some different ways of dealing with the stuff that life throws at them through social and emotional learning, I think that's really important. So also just because, I think anything we can do to give them more protective factors is important because there's so many more risk factors than protective factors. It's a little disheartening. So as someone mentioned, I think in the chat too, this is a huge protective factor for teens in all different aspects. Chat. I think it was, Nancy said, their skills necessary to succeed academically, socially, and in the workforce. And that's just so true. A lot of what current studies around social and emotional learning are very school-based because a lot of times this learning is done in a school setting. They have a curriculum that they work with these students throughout the whole year on. So they've been really able to do some great studies about this. And they've just shown so many great improvements. So fewer students reporting anxiety, greater motivation to learn, fewer delinquent acts, fewer reports of student depression, so many benefits to having youth learn these skills. It's also a very teachable skill. Anyone can learn these things. And it's a soft job skill. So that's a big buzzword. Soft job skills, something you can take to whatever job you go to. And this is really one of those things. So it's great because it's going to benefit our teens no matter what they do, whether they're going to college, whether they're doing like a 2-year trades program, maybe they're staying home and having a family. All of those things, it's going to benefit them long term. So I have to remember, I have to do this. Okay. So where do libraries sort of fit into this? Because I've talked a lot about schools and curriculum, and we don't necessarily get the same kids every week. So having like a curriculum that we like sit them down and be like, okay, class, we're going to talk about X. That's not how we run our programs. That's not how kids show up to our programs. So we don't have week after week the same kids. It's not like a school where they have kind of this captive audience. So I really like this framework because it shows how where we can kind of fit. So if you have a school that's doing this social emotional learning, you can really see yourself as a support and that partnership where you're supporting them in what they're doing. So you could reach out to your school district and say, hey, are you guys doing any of this? How can I help support you when they come into the library afterwards? Are there techniques or tools you're using that I could also use? Just another great way to develop that partnership with your school system. And so that's one way you could do it if you have a great relationship or want to build that relationship with a school system, is just see yourself as that support to give those teens the opportunity to keep practicing those same skills so they get that continual kind of exposure to it. So now I want to talk a little bit about something called positive youth development. So I think we have a poll. If I'm correct. Yes. So go ahead. Have you guys ever heard of positive youth development? Just click yes or no. Okay, cool. Oh, I like this. Changes. Okay, so it looks like 5 people, no, 6 people have not heard of it, 3 people have. So that's great. But so the reason we're going to talk about positive youth development is that um, this is a map of what our county looks like. So what El Paso County looks like, that's where Pikes Peak Library District. We're basically all of El Paso County except for one little nugget that's not. And these are all of our school districts. We have 17 school districts that we cover in our district. I would say 5 or 7 of them have multiple high schools, so like 2 or more high schools. And so that means there's even more middle schools and even more elementary schools. So it's really hard for us to give very targeted programs based on what a school system is doing because there's so many and we don't want to favor one over the other. So we had to find something that wasn't so tied into just one type of curriculum when it comes to social emotional learning. So we heard about something called positive youth development. And what that is it's really an intentional and pro-social approach to engage youth in a way that's really productive and constructive and really recognizes youth as an asset and a strength in your community rather than just a problem to be solved. So you're not just looking at them and being like, got to figure out how to keep you in school. It's like, oh, you are a whole person. How can I support you and have you be integral to our community? Because that long term is going to be better for you than just like keeping you in school day after day. And that's the only thing I'm caring about you for, kind of a thing. So instead of just focusing on one single issue, agencies have been focusing a little bit more on promoting positive asset building, engaging, building those relationships with youth, all of those different things that you kind of see going into the circle. And then hopefully what we get out of it is the arrows moving away from it, which is young people move into healthy and productive adulthoods and really just have that sense of community. So if you don't have a school implementing a social and emotional curriculum that you can kind of build off of, or if you have 17 school districts to work with like we do, positive youth development is really a great set of just overarching principles to use in guiding your program. So you can still give them that chance to practice social and emotional learning outside of school, but it's not like you're like tied into this curriculum that you have to like have the same 6 kids for a whole year, because if you do that, you should be doing a webinar about how you get the same kids to come for a whole year. So that's kind of what we've identified as a way to help our youth and give us some standards and structure and guidelines about how we're doing programming. So there's 5 facets, and I will say I've taken these from a website that doesn't exist anymore. It was called Colorado 9 to 25, and it was focused on helping youth from ages 9 to 25 develop. And they had this really great explanation of positive youth development. You can find lots of other resources out there if you want to. You just look up positive youth development. Some of them are linked in our resources slide at the end. But these were the 5 facets that are pretty standard. But so it's strengths-based, so you're focusing on the strengths rather than seeing youth as a problem to be solved. It is inclusive. It's also really important that youth are seen as partners. So there's kind of a phrase, nothing for us without us. So you're not doing things kind of in a little adult land bubble where you're like, pony rides, that's the thing that's going to get the youth off the streets. And then the youth are like, but we hate ponies, we're allergic, we want nothing to do with ponies. Why are you doing this to us? So just making sure you always have that youth voice represented. It's collaborative. So again, you're not working in your own little like library bubble. You're reaching out to other organizations that are working with youth. And maybe if you're in a small town, that's like the school, but you and the school are working together and how you can both maximize your resources. And then it's also sustainable. So it's something that you can sustain long term. You're not going to do it for a year and then be like, whoops, sorry, kids, I know you liked this, but now it's gone. The other reason I really like positive youth development is, and this was something that again was on Colorado 9 to 25, but I think you can still keep this idea in your head. is you can do it on a spectrum. It's not like a set of curriculum where you have to implement it this exact way all of the time and check off all these boxes. You can start really small and take baby steps along the spectrum. So youth as partners, for example, that could start all the way down with doing a survey with your youth after a program, or having a comment box of like, what kind of programs do you want to see? That's engaging them as a partner. That's giving them a voice in what they want to see happening. And then there's at the very other end of the spectrum, having maybe a youth serving on your board of trustees as an equal voting member. So those are like very different, and there's a lot of different baby steps in there. So that's really what I like about it, is if you're still at the very start of one side of the spectrum, that's okay, because you can start where you are, and then maybe as you get comfortable there, you can look and be like, okay, what's my next little baby step? And so you can kind of, as your organization develops and gets more comfortable with this stuff, you can kind of take these little baby steps along the spectrum. And then another thing I wanted to just point out is that if you're familiar at all with YALSA's action plan, which YALSA is the Library Services Association for people working with young adults, they really grounded a lot of their action plan in these principles. So if this is something you want to do more of and you need some help maybe translating it into libraries, or maybe convincing an administration that you need to do this, they've kind of done some of that groundwork of like translating this over into libraries. Also, it's a national standard, so you can like play that card with your boss and be like, but YALSA says we need to do it, so we should do it. So after all of that, I want you guys to take a few minutes and think back to those protective factors we talked about, and maybe just think about what are some of the protective factors you've seen for teens in your community. Just share some of those in the chat.
I think you've seen things.
Yeah. I can give an example.
Yeah.
So when I was learning a lot about this, and especially like the relationship factor, I realized growing up, I was very involved with our church and did a lot of different things there. And the relationships I had with adults in that church, I realized later on, were a really big protective factor for me, because I knew I had other adults outside of my family, not that my family wasn't great or anything, that cared about me, knew what I was doing, would come up to me and be like, oh, I saw such and such in the paper, good job, or whatever. So just having kind of those relationships with other adults, I think was a really, was a protective factor for me.
Yeah, so if you think of some as we're going along, please feel free to type them in the chat, and of course, any questions that you might have. After school programs, yeah, those are great, because it's dedicated time where you can really get into different activities. That's for sure one. Yeah, another one. I'm going to keep going, but please keep typing in there. So what we want to look at next is really some of the practical application of what we're doing at Pikes Peak Library District. And just also keep in mind a few of our best practices that don't directly have to do with social and emotional learning, but that it can just happen. And like I said, you all are already doing this because you have time set aside where teens can hang out. So let's get into the next thing. So a few years ago, a teen asked us if we could start a D&D club at one of our libraries. I do not know much about Dungeons and Dragons, and so when we were doing that, we said yes, and we said, especially if you have friends to bring, because that really makes a big difference. And this club has been going strong for quite a few years now, and they've definitely created bonds in a lot of different ways. They're friends. And what has developed is the first 30 minutes. Not everybody can make it there right on time, but they just talk for 30 minutes before they even start playing. So it's pretty amazing to see what they're doing. And to get into this a little more about the social and emotional learning that can happen in something even like Dungeons and Dragons was from around 2016 in the election. Two teens who were already friends started talking about then candidate Trump, and the girl was talking about how Trump wasn't a good choice for the country because he's homophobic, and that's against who she is. And the boy was arguing that Trump was good for the country in other ways. So myself and another staff member, we stepped in and helped guide the conversation because it was getting pretty heated and both were starting to feel wronged. The girl was hurt that the boy wouldn't support her, and the boy seemed surprised to know someone who identifies as a lesbian. And so with a little bit of guidance, we were really able to help them manage their conflict. And so they were really learning relationship skills there. And that is something we didn't set out to do, but it's happening. So another thing that you can start looking at is how do you incorporate social and emotional learning into a pre-existing program? And we talked already about 2 programs that meet in person, but we wanted to also look at summer reading program, which is what we call Summer Adventure. So a few years ago, we went through a pretty big transition for our summer reading program where we really wanted to incorporate a lot of different types of activities in addition to the reading. So we used the badges above, or right here on the screen, to develop some of these. And we didn't do it on our own. Some of you might notice that in the Read badge, we do have a lot of similarities to the Reading Without Walls challenge. So we worked with other things that already existed, and that really made a big difference. So just to highlight a few of these, so reading about someone who looks or lives differently from you is about social awareness, so you can really understand what others are feeling. If you're going to make a soundtrack for a book, you can really look at knowing what you're feeling in the moment. And then if you spend an hour creating something, you're really persevering in the face of setbacks and frustration, especially if it's in a makerspace. And then I think one important thing when you're thinking about something like summer reading is to really make sure you're being inclusive and considering what barriers there are for teens to complete these. Do they require transportation? Do they cost money? And what could prevent a teen from completing an activity? So I see there's a few comments in here, and somebody asked if they can have a copy. Yeah, absolutely. We can email that. Great, Christine is saying we can make that happen. We also, this one is from a couple of years ago, and so we have other ones that we've updated and kept some that are based on teens participating and doing them. So we can include those for sure. And then I also saw that somebody had replied about one of the different things that they do, and we partner with their local youth empowerment council, which attends twice a month, and that kind of thing can make such a huge difference where it might be with a few youth and a bunch of adults, but it really can make a big difference in how all those organizations are really connected. So then, next what I wanted to talk about are some of the best practices that we look at when we're developing programs. So the SAFE acronym here, this is from actforyouth.net. And SAFE stands for sequential, active, focus, and explicit. And I think they pretty much speak for themselves, but I wanted to just dive in just a little bit. So sequential is really that the skills are being taught through sequenced activities. It's very logical and people can know what to expect. And then the active piece is that youth have opportunities to actively do the skill and to practice that skill. Because, there's a lot of times where we talk about theory and, all of that, and if they can actually practice the skill that you're trying to teach, that makes a big difference. And then they're focused. So there's specific time that's set aside for that skill practice. And then it's explicit. They're really saying, this is what you're learning. This is what you're trying to teach in this session. And so then a couple other things that we're really trying to keep in mind are talking about having value-added programs. So programs that are teaching skills for their future. So something like sewing or coding or storytelling. And what are the skills that they're actually learning and practicing when they're at a program at the library? And then another thing that's really can make a difference for developing relationships is having introductions at the beginning of a session. And one of the things can be to include your pronouns. And it's something that you could ask participants to do. But even if you don't do that and you say, hi, I'm Joanna and my pronouns are she, her, it can make a big difference for someone else who might say, oh, my pronoun is they. So it's really something that can welcome people. Another thing that's helpful at the beginning is to set ground rules or kind of like meeting norms for adults of what do we expect at this program. Another thing that we talked about a little bit before is really letting the team be the expert. This is something I love doing because things like Dungeons and Dragons and gaming, and we have a yo-yo champion teenager who does a program once a month here. I know very little about yo-yos. So when they're the expert, it really can build a lot for that youth. And I wanted to mention one where you can learn from our mistake. So we were approached to have a manga club available at the library, and I know a little bit about manga, but not that much. And so we said, sure, and the team is 16, and we thought, oh, great, she can volunteer. So we started having this manga club meet every week. It was every Saturday, and all we had to do was reserve the room and provide snacks, and we were getting 20 teens to come every week. It was amazing. We were getting great feedback from parents and siblings about how these teens felt like they had this wonderful space, and we were just patting ourselves on the back. But what ended up happening was we were having a 16-year-old manage relationships of 20 youth from throughout our community, and it was too much for her to do. Cliques started forming. Some youth were told they couldn't come anymore. There was just a lot of drama that was happening that we could have prevented by being there. So while it's important to have the teen be the expert, be the adult in the room and make sure that everybody is welcome and policies are being enforced. So as we get into our next part of the session, what we wanted to do was have an activity. And this is going to be maybe a little bit awkward because it's going to be 2 to 3 minutes of silence. But we're here. And what we want you to do is write down a few barriers that you think you could face in your library or community for implementing social and emotional learning. And type those in the chat area. Can I repeat that, please? Yes, I can. So what we want you to do is think about a few barriers, things that might get in the way for you to be able to implement social and emotional learning in your library, in programs, or in your community. You're welcome. Oh, time constraints? Yes. Holy cow. That's been a big thing. We've really eased into being able to incorporate social and emotional learning into our programs. Yeah. And then limited space to compete for other programs for certain times.
Yeah, and this might be something for competing for space and competing with other programs. If there are other teen programs, I would reach out and say, how can we work together? If it's like a children's program happening at your library, then I would say, is there another organization in your town or community you could reach out to and say, hey, we want to do this for teens. We don't have the space at this time. Maybe you do. And then again, you're working together collaboratively with all those organizations to best utilize resources.
Oh, yeah, and Sylvia says they don't have a meeting room. That makes it really tricky to do programs. One of the things that we've done in some of our spaces that are for teens to hang out in is that we've trained other patrons to know that from 3:30 to 5:30, it's going to be noisier. And it works when you train patrons appropriately.
Or depending on what your hours are, maybe you have a day you close a little bit earlier. You could do an after hours part program, even just right after you close for an hour. And then you can just do it in the main part of the library.
Oh, yeah. Someone else has a lot of teens who walk over, so having a program somewhere else would be difficult. Yeah, that definitely is. One of the things that we do is we will advertise where a program is so that parents know where to expect their teens to be. But if that's their only way of being transported is their feet, then that doesn't necessarily work. So Grace says that she doesn't really see barriers to implementing social and emotional learning in programs when they're structured and supervised, but the day-to-day teen zone life, one barrier is the lack of sufficient staff to be aware of everything. Yeah, and that can be a huge issue, is to have other staff who aren't hired specifically to work with teens to treat teens like people, and not as something that's really hard. Like, one of the main things that we talk about is don't have the only thing you say to a teenager be something negative. So talk to them, say hello when they come in, and that they're welcome there. And it makes it so that if you do have to say a corrective behavior to them, that it's easier.
I think, Rachel, your comment got cut off. It cuts off after that has.
So I think I'm seeing all of Rachel's comment. Local home group, very active in library programs, but she finds that even when they approach sort of this inclusive language ideas, that they leave in mass, and so that's become a big barrier.
Oh, yeah, that can definitely be something that's an issue, is that if there's inclusive language used. And there might be other ways to do that where it's not in a group setting, but people who it could make an impact to could do that. Like, even just having it on your name tag, if it's cool with your library. But you do have to respond to your community. So being creative about that can be tricky. Lack of staff, yeah. Well, so we're going to get into a few more barriers, but keep talking there and help each other out. Like, everybody here has a lot of really good experience. And so one of the things that we really wanted to focus on is reluctant admins. We practiced that trombone noise, just so you all know. So you can raise your hand with a little button. So if you would do that and say, who may have questions about this or thinks their admin was going to have some issues with that?
And if you can't find the raise your hand, it's in the upper kind of leftish middle of the screen. It's like a little person with their hand raised, and you can just use that to raise your hand.
Okay. No one has reluctant admin. That's amazing. It is cool. Well, I'm not seeing a ton of hands, which is actually really exciting because sometimes when you're talking about teens, admin can be like, they're noisy and sometimes they smell bad and all the other negative stereotypes about teenagers. Um, so it's really exciting to see how many of you have supportive administration. I will say here we're very lucky that we have a super supportive administration when it comes to teens. I think I found a document from like 1978 that was like young adult planning, like services for young adult planning. So that was really cool. But we're just going to go through a couple of things you can do if you're having trouble getting admin to come and see your side of things. So I like to say for this, you can really blind them with science because social emotional learning and positive youth development are really grounded in evidence-based practices. So you can give them so many resources and you can really give them resources and scientific studies that show why it's important. Something else, if you maybe your admin is really supportive, but you're having other staff who don't really understand why you need to do this kind of stuff, you can kind of apply these principles to other staff members, not just administration. So again, really blinding them with science, and I think really giving a very concrete plan that connects all those dots for them of why it's important, how you're going to do it, and kind of what that outcome is going to be. People don't always have the time to go out and connect those dots for themselves. So if you can just give that to them all in one spot, it really can help bring them around to your way of thinking.
Yeah, and this is Joanna again, and I really wanted to talk about the first library where I worked. I was hired to be on desk for 32 hours a week, and my total shift time was 32 hours a week. And so I was told no a lot with all of my ideas. And at first, I was really disappointed because I was so excited about doing a bunch of different things, but that wasn't my role. And it really taught me how to present ideas to other people to get support for those ideas. And while it can be difficult or kind of discouraging or time consuming to do a bunch of that research and that type of thing, giving that information and thinking through everything that you're really looking at doing, including how you're going to evaluate it, makes a big difference in the quality of the program and the support that you can get. So one thing that we have that could be a tool that you could use is this program proposal form. And some library systems might already have it. But even for something that you're going to do, it can help you think through everything that you're looking at. And so if you want this, we can put it on the website as well. But keep in mind that this might exist at your library system, even if you haven't heard of it, because sometimes things like these are buried. So this is something that was inspired by the YALSA presentation submission form, because they really encourage a lot of thinking through what you're going to be presenting about. And so this helps us with that too. So I mentioned evaluation really briefly, but I did want to point out Project Outcome. Project Outcome is from the Public Library Association, and it's free to use to do surveys, but it's very restricted on questions you can ask. And it's because they have people who know how to do surveys write the questions so that you can get that kind of really good, reliable information. And then you can also compare those results with other library systems in the country. It's really pretty great.
So now we're going to talk just a little bit about some of those really common objections, maybe not your admin, but other staff. They might be asking, like, why do we need to teach that to teens? And I would just say it's not something that's super intuitive. When I learned about it, I was like, oh yeah, I can really tell like my self-management in this area is not as good as it could be, and here's the things I can do to make it better. Also, the development in a teenage brain is like bananas. It's the only other time that you have more brain development is when you're 0 to 2. So a ton is happening, and social and emotional learning really gives them tools to be able to cope with all the changes that are happening developmentally in their brains. You might hear like, shouldn't the parents be doing that? And they should. It's part of their job. But a lot of times when you look at youth development theory, there's always a component of it that is based in the community. Teens don't live in a bubble. They don't just live at home. They go out in the community. And so it's our job to help them learn how to be adults, just like it's their parents' job, because they're not going to just live at home all their life. They're going to go out into the community. They need to know how to interact with everyone. So we all need to work together, support parents, and help them out with this task. And then why should we be concerned with it? And again, this kind of goes back to the very beginning when we talked about why this is so important. And it's such a long-lasting thing that affects every aspect of their life. It affects their personal relationships. It affects their academics. It affects their job. It's super effective at what it does. And it's long-lasting. I think there was a study that I read where they gave a group of kindergartners a social emotional curriculum, and then they kept studying them throughout, checking in with them. And I think it was like 18 years later, they still saw an impact from that intervention they had as kindergartners. So it's very long-lasting. It's something that you can do that will affect their whole life. It's also part of the YALSA competencies. We talked about that. So again, it can be something you point to and say, this is something libraries across the country are doing. We need to be a part of this. Okay. So the last thing we're going to touch on is the Summer Teen Volunteer Program with the Library Research Service. So a little history. Joanna and I first did this presentation at CalCon, which is Colorado's Library Association Conference in 2018, in the fall of 2018. We also did it at YALSA in 2018. And while we were there, we kind of talked about how we've just learned about this. We are seeing that it's happening in our library, but we're not necessarily doing it intentionally. And so that was our next step at that point, was we really want to figure out how can we do this intentionally and how can we measure that it's happening. And so at that first presentation, we met Katie Fox, who is a research analyst with Library Research Services, which is part of the Colorado State Library. And so she saw our presentation and reached out to us. She had done a study on social and emotional learning with Denver Public Library that summer and asked if we wanted to work together on something. So we were super excited and said yes. So that led to a lot of discussions about all the different programs we saw social and emotional learning happening in. And then we kind of narrowed down that list to what are the ones that we could actually influence in some way. And then that led us to, okay, we can influence these. Which ones do we get the same teens over a period of time in? So what that led us to was our Teen Summer Volunteer Program, because we would have consistent teens over a set period of time. We will have teens sign up to be summer reading volunteers in June and July, and they're expected to work, we let them sign up for shifts, but usually you get consistent base over those two months. But the most important thing is we would be really easy to get parental signatures saying that it was okay for us to track and collect data about their children. So we had our program figured out, and so the process we came up with for the study, I'm just laughing at the comment. Notice that most adults are scared of teenagers, and it's true. And usually I tell people that teenagers are actually really used to being told what to do by adults, so they don't always they may be more scared of you than you are of them type of situation sometimes. But so for our study, we had 5 out of our 14 libraries participate as pilot libraries. So these libraries had their volunteers take a training curriculum in June and July. That was set up as like a job skills training program, but really was kind of foundationally underlaid with these social and emotional skills. So we tried to help them improve things like social self-management, initiative, professionalism. And so they were supposed to take this training during their time volunteering. And then to assess whether or not it worked, we had all of the pilot group teams take a pre, mid, and post assessment about how they rated themselves on those skills. We also had staff observe a sample of the pilot group twice in the summer to see if our observations of them and their progress matched their observations and progress. And then we did have all of our other libraries who had teen volunteers. Those teams also took the pre and post assessment as well. This was to really see if any changes we saw in our pilot group was simply just because of the volunteer program itself. So if that control group also saw similar improvements, then we would know it doesn't have anything to do with our curriculum. It's just they were volunteering and learned stuff. We are still in the midst of coding that data because that newsflash takes a long time when you're also trying to do all your other stuff. So we're still coding the data to figure out how the curriculum, how those training programs worked, if we saw improvements. And so once we have that information, what we really want to do is assess the training, change things if we need to, and at some point, ideally, the goal would be to share the data of like, hey, this is what we did, this is what worked, and then also share the training and share that structure. So if another library wanted to implement it with their volunteers or another job skills type of group, they would have something with a little bit of research behind it where we said, you know, we studied this and it did show after this intervention, they did show improvement. And again, like I said, while it's kind of in a job skills costume, a lot of the stuff underneath are those social emotional skills. It's communication, self-management, problem-solving skills. So it's all really rooted and founded in social and emotional learning. Whew. All right. So thank you guys so much for listening and participating. It was awesome to hear from you. I guess we have a little bit of time if you guys have any questions.